G'day Stephen, thanks again for your time today. We are on the topic of organisational politics this week, which sort of sits at that darker end of what happens in organisations, but as you know, it's a prominent part of organisational life.
Absolutely.
So let's just begin with, from your perspective, background on what organisational politics is.
So I like the idea that politics is bordering on the dark, because a lot of my work tries to work between the light and the dark and acknowledge that the dark is very much part of life and organisational life. So the first thing I think is relevant is that politics is the process of gaining and using power.
Right.
Okay? And I suppose in that context, power can also be dark and light.
Yep.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about what light power is and what dark power is. So what most of us think about as politics is what we see on the TV screens, reading the newspapers about politics and the politics of the various persuasions. And what we see is they're always trying to control the message that goes out to the electorate, and they're always trying to influence us to believe what they're telling us, to believe that it will be good for us individually as a community, consistent with our beliefs about how society should be. And so continuously they're trying to influence us on a day-to-day basis, so when it comes to voting, that they will have our vote.
Yep.
And I think that is relevant in probably every society in the world. There's some political process going on, whether it be free democratic or all the others.
Yep.
So if we jump then from political life in that context to organisational life has, I think, exactly the same requirement, because a leadership group and a board of directors is continually putting up a statement about what they stand for as an organisation.
Right.
So why they exist, how they're going to behave in the pursuit of that why, and then importantly what they're going to do to satisfy stakeholders, whether they be shareholders, customers, suppliers, employees. So the strategic group in any organisation, if they're good at what they do, are very clear about what their intent is, so what they stand for, much like a political party. And then on a day-to-day basis, if they're good at what they do, they're continuously influencing everybody in the organisation, from the forklift driver or the accounts payable clerk to senior managers and directors.
Right.
So I'm in that sense, I'm defining politics as the process of influencing people to jump on board what that leadership group is saying about where we're going.
Yep.
And how we're going to get to where we're going. And so that's the process that they're actively involved in, which once again, we know that leadership group has been given a level of authority or power by them either being the owner of the business. So if I'm the owner and I'm the boss, I have all the power.
Yep. If
it's a public company, then it's a board of directors who hires a CEO, who then delegates their authority down to senior managers and leaders,
right,
who then delegate their authority down. And so in effect, that power is distributed through an organisation depending on the type of organisation and the culture within that organisation. And so everyone down the organisation has degrees of power to act within their sphere of responsibility.
Right.
So with the CEO, the sphere of responsibility is everything. With a board, it's everything, and also external stakeholders and political and the like, political parties and the like. So that's the challenge. And power can also be, so I may be the CEO, you may be the CEO, and you have power, and you can use your power in a very light way, transparent, open, everybody knows, or it can be in a little bit more dark in that context.
Right.
Behind the scenes,
Yep.
no one knows what's going on. People feel like they get shafted.
Yep.
So the culture that I carry as the CEO will determine how politics and power plays out in an organisation.
It's very interesting. Can I just ask a quick question while you're there? It's a very interesting view of politics. Sort of defining it as the process of influence makes me think, in that sense, it's very similar to leadership. I mean, you would think as leadership as being a process of influencing people to meet objectives, overcoming challenges to meet objectives. So in that way, is politics part of every organisation? And if it's so similar to leadership and influence, are there organisations that aren't political?
Well, if we define, it depends how we define politics, because politics is a very important part of our society, and it's a very important part of the democratic process here in Australia, and we need those people to represent us, and how well we're represented is determined by the democratic process. But as we all know, sometimes politics is ugly and it's not something that we're proud of, and we often have politicians who we don't think represent us well and in entirety. But if we then move politics to power, and we say what we're going to talk about is the use of power in a good, ethical way that embraces the idea that a leader is going to educate and direct in terms of strategic direction, and then where the people will then be behind that strategic intent, and we'll all work as one. And so as a leader, you need to make sure that, one, there's clarity about where we're going. There's also clarity about why we're going to go there, and can we go there, and do we have the capability to go there, and there are systems to go there. So that the leadership task is that whole thing.
Okay.
But once again, it's a demonstration of the power of the leader.
Right.
And we'll talk a little bit about culture, individual people's own personal development, and how that links to culture, and how an organisation may have multiple cultures within one organisation, because one department could have one culture and another department, based on the leader, would have another department, another culture. So it is a complex picture, a little bit like political parties who are complex beings, and sometimes you hear people with insight and depth who never attack anybody else in their process. You might see a peer with a totally different style saying the same thing, but doing it in a way that denigrates everybody else. So there is that sort of challenge.
Given the strong links with influence, so if we look at politics as happening through influence, group or person A influences group or person B to do what group or person A wants. Sometimes that influence, like you said, the darker side, could not be in the best interests of person or group B. What can person or group B do to sort of resist that negative influence of politics, if it's necessary?
It's certainly an important thing for any person, employee, or someone looking for a job. I think they need to look very carefully about and do a lot of research about the organisation they're going to work with. And that may be in the public domain information in terms of what the organisation stands for, what their strategic intent is. And perhaps it makes sense just to present that picture with a slide, so for people they can understand. So what I've got here is, so we're talking about influence. And the truth is, in any organisation, everything comes back to people, because an organisation does not exist without someone's idea, who then takes that idea into their will forces and creates an organisation. It's an initiative. And in that initiative, if they're successful and customers want what they're offering, that business grows. And as that business grows, then that person or persons needs to hire and recruit people to come and join that organisation. So usually what happens is So we use this as a way of explaining organisations that those top three elements are the why the organisation exists. So when someone starts a business, there will always be a reason. It might be because I want to be my own boss, so I'm going to be self-employed. But often they have another intent that's deeper than the one about... So one might be about their own personal choice, that they don't want to have a boss, that they want to be free to do what they want to do.
Right.
But they also may see a need in the marketplace and they want to fulfil that need. So there might be something driven in them about wanting to provide a solution to a problem that is not solved.
Right.
And nearly most organisations have a much deeper reason for being than just money.
Okay. Yeah.
So whenever I ask people, it is about security. But once I always say to them, so now that you've got more money than you can ever spend,
right,
what's really important?
Right.
And then they'll often tell me what's really important, which is I want to create an organisation that allows people to develop.
Yeah.
Or I want to provide a technology that allows humanity to progress.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Or I want it to be a beautiful environment, so I created this product that allows a cleaning capability or an environmental picture.
Right.
There's always something deeper than money.
Right. Right.
Money's important.
Yep.
And so the why is the reason for being. We often could talk about it as the vision or leading image. So the second aspect is what often happens is an organisation gets busy doing the what. So the why is what triggers me to do something.
Yep.
I then start an initiative and I start doing something, which is the what. And that what might be me as a consultant starting a new organisation or consulting business, might be you in academia creating a certain course.
Yep.
There's something that needs to be done that we see. So we create a strategic plan that details the what we need to do, and we need to build a very concrete picture of success so we know when we get there. So I've got up there aims. So the what is about the aims of the organisation, whether that be this week, this month, this year, and also 3-year, 10-year, 20-year.
Right.
So we know why we've done it. We now know what we're going to do. And the third aspect in that is strategic intent is the values and policies and the how. Now, when a business first starts as a pioneering business, the how is probably tertiary. What is everything when we start?
Yep.
Even the why might not be conscious for the pioneer. They just get on with doing something, and it's only when they reflect that they think about, I'm not doing it, So I think about when JFK said we're going to put man on the moon. That was a what, wasn't why.
Right.
So as soon as man was on the moon, the project was over.
Yep.
But the why was something that was probably never articulated, whether that was to be able to control the world or to expand human dimension or capability or whatever.
Right.
So at some point, and it might not be in this pioneering phase, the question about how we want to behave with each other and be with each other in terms of values and policies, behaviours, tends not to become conscious until an organisation is successful enough where they start to bring more people into the organisation.
Right.
And people start to ask, so what do you stand for?
Yep.
If I'm going to bring myself and bring the best part of myself to your business, what is it you stand for? So I'm then forced as the pioneer to articulate what's important.
Right.
And that might come out of my why.
Yep.
So I remember Hewlett-Packard, I think the Packard side of that, he had a very strong sense of development of people, whereas the other side of it was about creating technologies that were required in the world to progress the world in its evolution. So those three things, the why, the what and the how, are the strategic intent, but obviously they only are delivered by people. Okay? Right. No one else comes up with those three things. Yeah. So if we then look at, so I talk about that as it gives the organisation its orientation, and the other three beacons are three beacons whereby their structure and function, which is how an organisation is structured, the functions within that, the job descriptions, the role that I'm applying for will fit into that bit. Then there are processes that are created for an organisation to manage its value chain and every supporting function that's behind it. And then there is a resource deployment element. Now, people is the centre, and influence is what works within those people in a relationship context for how decision making happens in an organisation. So as a pioneer, one person may be making all of the decisions, but if you and I are successful in our business pursuit, we'll need to have a group of people in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, and that may end up being hundreds of thousands of people. And as we grow, we need to formalise our business so we can deploy decision making down the organisation in a way that's consistent with decisions that you and I would make today. So we need to formalise our thinking and specialise the business and create processes that allow the business to be conducted in a way that's congruent with
how we want it to be.
And so in that context, the decision-making context then needs people involved, and those people will influence the group of people making that decision. And so influencing is a skill that every single person needs to learn if they want to be an active member of an organisation and an active member of any decision-making process. So just to finish that picture, these 7 beacons all work with each other all the time. So what we're talking about is that people create the strategic intent. People are then responsible for deploying that strategic intent, and congruence, which is we are what we say we are, lives in structure, function, process, resource. So if we're doing a climate survey in terms of culture, we go and ask people who work in the business whether the business is what it says it's going to be. And as a point of reference, I just found a cartoon which suggested that things can sometimes be a little bit different from that.
Is it on the back page there? No?
Let me just find it. And it says, I want the public to think of us as a company with a heart, but I want you to think of us as a company that will chew you up, spit you out, and smear you into the carpet if you screw up. So when we talk about politics and the deployment of that approach, we're talking about a large system where there's lots of conscious intent or not to make sure that what we are is what we say we are. And so for you for someone who's going for a job, you want to find out whether the organisation is what it says it is. So it puts an ad in the paper. It says it's this. If you go to a job interview, your interest is it really this? Or is it something else?
That's very interesting, and it suggests that politics is really embedded deeply in all aspects of an organisation. Its processes, its structures, its culture.
Absolutely.
And then tying that with the influence, as someone that's done the research into an organisation and is thinking about joining an organisation, how do I know whether the influence through politics is going to be good or bad?
It's a tough call, tough question. So let's go back and just look at. So in my research of preparing today, we all know that the line that says power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that's a truism. So with that in the back of our mind as a reality, there are some political behaviours or skills that we need to develop. One is we need the ability to network and to develop relationships that enhance our career progression. So that means you are going to actively influence your career path. And obviously there's going to be people who support you in that development. And a qualification is a starting point for a career progression. But how you present yourself and how you are in organisational life will determine your success based on your strategic aims of what you want in your career. So networking is one skill that you need to develop.
And that's very well supported by research. So
the idea is that you build a system in yourself about the map of relationships, because even though someone is very senior in an organisation and has formal power,
Yep.
they may not be the decision maker.
Right.
It
right.
could be 1 or 2 levels down a person who is the centre of gravity for all conversation.
Right.
And they know.
Right.
So networking is one.
Yep.
The other thing is a concept of reciprocity, that if in your role someone helps you,
Yep.
then you should be conscious of giving back to that, so it builds a relationship of reciprocity.
Right.
And
right.
that's another political skill that
Right.
ensures you build healthy relationships which you can then depend upon, because it may well be that you end up in a meeting and
Yeah.
if you know people well and they know you, they're
Yeah.
more likely and you're more credible when
Right.
you present your picture of why we should go down path A
Sure.
and not path B.
Sure. Just on the reciprocity, it's very interesting that you brought that up. I wonder if one can be more proactive in building reciprocity politically. So
Yep.
doing a favour for a target or a target of influence based on knowledge that that person down the track will be obligated to return a favour. So rather than returning a favour that's been done for you, could we use it more proactively and
Yeah.
do favours to...
So you pass something forward.
Yeah, with the...
So
that'd be quite political as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I use a simulation called RedBlue, and it talks about adversarial acts,
Right.
which withdraw
Yep.
from the relationship,
Yep.
versus a collaborative act, which means that I might help you,
Right.
and you may scratch your head and say, why are you helping me?
Right.
But I'm actually helping you because, one, that's what I want to do.
Yep.
I think my job will be done better if you do your job better. So if you're a
Right.
supplier or a customer,
Yep.
I might actively go and do something. And when I do something that we might call it a random act of kindness,
Yep.
but I'm actually doing it consciously because I know that our
Yep.
business outcome, we're interdependent on each other. If you're more successful, I'm more successful.
Right. Yep.
And if I've done something that helps you be successful,
Yep.
then you should be conscious of also seeing me as part of your network,
Yep.
and then look for opportunities to support me in a similar way.
Yep.
So it
Yep.
creates this reciprocity.
Yep.
So the third aspect is the ability to build coalition, and we've spoken a little bit already that you need to talk to people and understand where they're at. So if you're about to be part of a decision-making process,
Yep.
it's good to go and meet people who are part of that decision-making process,
Right.
build relationship with them, ask them
Yep.
where they are in the context of this decision,
Right.
ask them why they're there,
Right.
and build an understanding of the thinking that's going on. So when you actually get to the decision-making process, there will be no surprises. And so
Right.
the Japanese do this incredibly well. Most decisions are already made before they get to the meeting, okay?
Yep.
In a very clean, hygienic, socially constructive way.
Right.
So coalition building, and coalition building is consciously influencing people
Sure.
in groups.
Okay. Yep.
So the other three that are worth mentioning. So we've done networking, reciprocity, coalition building. Controlling information is another one. In a political environment, I will consciously control information so I know more than anybody else.
Right.
Because information is power.
Right. Right.
Okay?
Right.
And in a political process,
Yep.
it happens all the time. It's very unhealthy in organisational life if people are only sharing parts of the information, because when we come to decision making,
Yep.
the best decisions are the ones that we implement fully and deliver the value that we expect them to deliver.
Right.
And the only way to achieve that is to have a holistic picture building process. So we build a picture
Yep.
of the issue. We have clear criteria that we're all going to use to make a decision.
Yep.
We make a decision and then we implement and look back on that decision and see the success we achieved.
Right. Right.
If the political process is active and we all only have part pictures,
Yep.
we'll never make the best decision.
Right.
Or we'll make a decision that suits you, but not us.
Right.
You know, so that's when you get empire building.
Yep.
It's when you get vested interests playing out, and they're all examples of an organisational culture that's less than best.
Right.
Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So controlling information. The other two, managing impressions. So very important that when you apply for a job, your first impression is your job application and your resume.
Yeah.
And so so if you think that needs to get me an interview, that's the job of that process only.
Yeah.
You don't need to do anything other than get an interview.
Yeah.
And then at an interview, there's a second impression.
Right.
How will I present myself? So I need to think about how I'm going to dress, how I'm going to be, the personality I'm going to take, how I'm going to listen, how I'm going to interact, the questions I'm going to ask, and how I respond.
Right.
So that's a very significant second impression.
Right.
And then often, that third impression is when you turn up to work, and are you what you created as an impression in the first and second. Right. So managing impressions.
There is quite a bit of literature in that area, in the impression management and career success sort of domain, and so it does seem to lead to more promotions, more likelihood of being promoted on the job if you're managing your impressions, depending on the tactic that you're using.
Yeah.
So where supervisors see these as genuine sort of attempts to show a favourable impression, it can generate liking, and liking transmits more promotions for that employee. But where it's perceived as a little bit sort of false or manipulative, it can backfire a little
Absolutely.
bit as well.
So yes, you need to be careful, and you need to be congruent, and you need to be truthful and ethical in those impressions.
Right.
And what we're talking about is being conscious.
Yep.
That, and I remember in the 1980s there was the research about Swedish organisation, and they spoke about moments of truth.
Oh yeah.
So these impressions are moments of truth.
Right.
But you better make sure that they're aligned, because if you give different impressions, people will pick up that you're not
the whole thing
congruent.
breaks down.
Yeah. The last one, and more on the dark side, is this attacking and blaming. So it's another political behaviour. It's another influencing skill. I'm not a big fan of it. But it is a coping mechanism that we all have to experience, and we will experience in organisational life. And if we can understand why that person is behaving that way, then that helps us to see the system and understand what that person is doing and why.
Sure.
So there's some political behaviours. Let's just talk about then influencing a little bit more. So influencing is one of the 12 emotional intelligence competencies. Right. So let's just look at that. So these 12. So this is the Goldman research, and Hay Group and Goldman have developed a product called SKey, so Emotional and Social Competence Inventory. Okay. And they break emotional intelligence up into these 4 quadrants. So they talk about self-awareness and other awareness. And they talk about management, self-management and relationship management. And so there are 12 competencies, 1 competency in self-awareness, and then the rest are broken up, and we'll just go through those. So the idea here is that influence is very much part of this relationship management process. Right. But influencing needs self-awareness, social awareness and self-management to get it right. Because we want to influence constructively and in a way that enhances our position towards our career objectives. So if we break down those 12 competencies, we've got 1, as I said, in emotional intelligence. Self-management has achievement orientation, adaptability, emotional self-control, positive outlook. So really they're, I think, separate from specific influencing or political behaviours.
Self-understanding.
But when we go to empathy and organisational awareness has a lot to do with influencing, because organisational awareness means that we need to keep our ear to the ground and know what's going on in the business. We need to be aware of what the rumour mill is and aware of what the formal communication channels are. Right. We need to actually learn by example. We need to watch people who are successful and observe what they do to be successful. Right. And once again, that allows us to build an impression of
Right.
how we need to be in this organisation.
Right.
We need, in the organisational awareness, we need to find out who has the power,
Yep.
both formal and informal,
Yep.
because often it's the informal power that surprises us, that we think we're talking to the right person,
Yep.
but all of a sudden we realise that someone over here is going to make this decision.
Right. Right.
And our organisational awareness is knowing who that person is.
Yes. Okay.
Organisational awareness is about getting points of view from people around you,
Yep.
because that allows you need to create your perceptions, but perceptions are reality when they're broader based and they involve the whole system. So the more
Right.
people you speak to,
Yeah.
so you have to make a decision to network. So going
Yeah.
back to that political skill,
Yes.
that networking process is very important. Building coalitions,
Yes.
asking people where we're going
Right.
is very much part of this organisational awareness.
Right.
And the last point about organisational awareness is you need to get support from
Yeah.
the right places.
Right.
Now that might be that your first job, you don't have a connection with your boss or superior, but other superiors you have a very strong connection with, and I would suggest that you nurture those relationships, because we need lots of support through our career,
Yep.
and different people can help us at times that we can never expect.
Right.
So never not do the work and build that network
Right.
of yours.
Gives you access to power.
Absolutely, gives you access
Yeah.
to power.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then the fourth part of this emotional intelligence is conflict management is one skill, coach and mentor, influence, inspirational leadership and teamwork. And obviously influence is a competency which is nurtured. And to sort of ground that competency, I just thought I'll read out these questions which are part of their survey diagnostic. So
Okay.
convince others by getting support from key people, convinces others by using multiple approaches.
Yep.
So that means there's always more than one solution to a problem.
Right.
Give
Right.
people multiple solutions.
Yep.
Allow them the freedom to choose. Don't force them don't
Right.
push them into the wall and force them of yours. Always be thinking of multiple options. And a great leader
Yep.
always can see multiple ways to get to the same point,
Yep.
and they have that flexibility and agility to say, well, the will of the people is for option A.
Right.
I actually think option B will be better,
Yep.
but if they don't think it'll be better, it won't be, because we won't implement successfully.
Sure.
So back to that decision-making process.
Right.
Right. Anticipates how others will respond when trying to convince them. Convinces others by developing behind-the-scenes support, so that Japanese approach.
Yep.
Actually have the decision made before you get there.
Yep.
And then convinces others through discussion. So they're the formal questions. The other thing that Hay Group have done is that they've introduced a document specifically for influencing, which
Okay.
perhaps recognises the politics in organisational life
Yeah.
and how and so I went through a process, and we can and what this is a profile. It's a profile of my influencing skills, and it gave me a picture of what I could improve. So in that it talks about very high, so they define influencing, and their elements: empowerment, interpersonal awareness, bargaining, relationship building, organisational awareness, common vision, impact management, logical persuasion and coercion. Now we could see coercion as the dark side,
Yep.
but it's there.
And you scored quite low on that. Is that what?
Yeah, so I fortunately, I was quite comfortable scoring very low, because I personally don't. It's something that you need to do sometimes, but very rarely.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And it doesn't really generate genuine commitment to anything.
And
It's
long
based on
term,
fear.
it might work once,
Yeah.
but fear will only work in the short term, not
Yeah.
the long term.
Yeah.
So for people who are interested,
Yep.
there is research conducted about developing your influencing skills, which is important.
Thank you.
Um,
Yeah.
So we've spoken about how people and relationships fit into these organisational beacons. The next thing I want to talk about is deepening this concept of power, and let's just present another picture of an organisation. So we spoke about the 7 beacons. This is another picture, and it breaks the organisation into these 3 parts. And let me just bring up those so you can understand it. So what it's highlighting is that the organisation has a leadership and management component. It has an organisational structure, power, and all the way through to workplace culture, and that's one continuum.
Yep.
And then at the bottom there's a marketplace. And so the idea is that, as we said, a pioneer has an idea. If the marketplace likes it, they'll buy it,
Yep.
and that will lead to growth in the organisation, which will then lead to a more developed leadership and management construct, which will then impact on how we're going to delegate power,
Yep.
and how power is delegated and used determines workplace culture. So what I'd like to do is then talk about this specific. The line through the middle is, it gives a picture that each person has a role in the organisation, and that's within one function, and then that function is within the organisation. So the outer circle is what's going on in the whole organisation,
Yep.
and then there's the inner circle is what's going on within each functional area,
Yep.
and then there's obviously the person, and they bring those 4 functional areas into their job. Okay, and so power and trust is seen on the same continuum, and power is determined, as we spoke before, by the organisational structure.
Right.
We consciously, the CEO or board consciously delegates power
Right.
to individuals down the organisation. So depending on how devolved an organisation is,
Yep.
so some people have all the process people having all the power in the process.
Right.
A more structured hierarchical business will have power operating at the top.
Yep.
And so culture will determine how much power is delegated down the organisation. So in this, what I'd like to do is then break into this trust and power to give people a sort of second picture of it, and I use this in my work. So it talks about power at one end and trust at the other, and negotiated agreement. Okay, and as a manager, as a person, I need to consciously think about how I'm going to use my power.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
and in decision making, I need to consider it. So what this suggests, this trust, and I call this the trust and power scale. In a healthy organisation,
Yep.
it operates on this scale.
Right.
Light power
Yep.
operates, and good culture operates
Right.
on this scale.
Can I just ask a quick question, just if
Yep.
to clarify, in case students are wondering, is this suggesting that where power doesn't play much of a role in decision making is based more on trust?
Yes, it is.
Where there's an absence of trust, it's more based on formal
Power.
sort of power.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. All right.
And
Yep.
the objective is to bring both those extremes
Right.
into the middle.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay?
Yep. Yep.
Because blind trust is not helpful. So you and
Right.
I might be very close. We've worked together for
Yep.
10 years.
Right.
We don't even have to say anything, and we make agreements.
Right.
That's a wonderful way of working, and we all love that. But when we now have 10 people with us,
Yeah.
and 8 people are trying to work out how we make decisions,
Right.
we need to come down the trust scale
Right.
into this arranging and agreeing. So rather than just recognising it with you and I, that's
Yep.
blind.
Yep.
It's wonderful for you and I, but it's not good for anybody else.
Everyone else, yep.
They feel like there's a click. They feel like they can't get in.
Right.
Okay?
Right. Right.
And so different organisations in different teams need to be very conscious of this, high trust environment.
Yep.
We don't want to make it blind trust, where we follow each other
Right.
without question.
Right.
We want
Right.
it to be conscious, and we
Yep.
want to make the agreement conscious. So we will consciously bring ourselves down into this centre,
Right.
so everyone around us will see how we've made this decision. Okay, so recognising just means we just look at each other and we know.
Yep.
Attuning means we have a conversation and we're both on the same page.
Yep.
This arranging and agreeing means that we consciously verbalise it, so everyone around us knows why we're making the decision.
Right.
So that's in the middle. And then we've got the power scale, and we've got laws. So, I had to drive on one side of the road and wear a seatbelt.
Right.
You will have laws about coming to work and harassment and bullying and pay rates and all those sorts of things. So
Right.
that's where laws relate. norms and regulations then are things that exist in organisations. So at Monash University,
Right.
You'll have certain norms and regulations which will be on top of the laws that exist in society
Right.
that will determine how things happen at Monash University. Okay?
Yep.
And then there's another level within that. So the norms and regulations may be written policies,
Yep.
but within that, people have somewhere to play in the policy, and there are what we call play rules.
Yep.
So that's, we're all playing in the sandpit,
Yep.
and we're following the laws and we're following the norms and regulations, but there are still play rules about how to play in the sandpit, and that's where values and behaviours come in.
Right.
So what we're doing is here, if I'm your boss and you're not doing well,
Yep.
and we have a performance conversation, and I say, so some of your behaviour is not consistent with the values and behaviours of our organisation. We need you to do this.
Yep.
We need you to stop yelling at people as a manager.
Yep.
And I may need to offer you some training and education and development.
Right.
And if you accept it but do nothing, then I may then need to start performance managing you,
Yep.
giving you a letter of warning,
Right.
and I move down into the norms and regulations, and then I move
Right.
down into the power, and then I dismiss you.
Right. So it's away from trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the reason why it's in the light is because I'm doing it.
Right.
And I've told you I'm doing it.
Right.
And everybody in that group of people knows that there's a formal performance management process, and that's healthy.
Right.
The thing that's not healthy is when things happen that no one knows about.
Right.
Okay?
Yep.
So off this scale are the dark side of life. It's
Yep.
when people get manipulated, when people get pushed into roles that no one knows about.
Yep.
A role gets created and all of a sudden Bill, my friend, gets the job. There's no formal transparency or recruitment process.
Right.
And so in my work, I'm always trying to move on to the power and trust scale, and that
Right.
means we need to have difficult conversations
Yep.
throughout our process in performance management, but in organisational life, making decisions. We need to name what the truth is.
Right.
And so part of the politics is not naming what's there. Now,
Okay.
this is something that we work quite actively with, and just ask people, so are we on the trust and payout scale?
Right.
Okay. Now, this is once again, if I'm a leader and I've never ever, so I think about a leader having a loaded gun in their pocket because they've got power to sack someone,
Yep.
but if they've never seen to pull their gun out, they have enormous influence because power is a very blunt instrument. Okay. Versus if that manager and leader works on trust and relationship,
Yep.
the level of power they have is much greater than the formal power.
Right.
Because
Right.
their influence is substantial.
Right.
So when something significant happens in an organisation, they become the go-to person because
Right.
they understand the system of relationships.
Yes.
And it's not about power, it's
Yep.
about influence.
Yep.
And influence is far more powerful than formal power.
Power. Yeah.
So it sort of gives you a sense of how influence plays on a scale,
Yep.
and certain people are far more capable, and we can say, going back to the emotional intelligence, they're far more emotionally intelligent to know the right decision
Right.
because they can see the consequences of a decision.
Right. Right.
So I might make a decision that means I win
Yep.
today, but I might lose the whole workforce.
Sure. Or the
And that's-
commitment. Yeah.
Or the commitment.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a very important part of this picture about influencing, and how you actively work with these political behaviours
Right.
to be able to work on this scale. Now, if you're working with someone who
Yep.
doesn't work on the scale,
Yep.
you've got challenges, and let me give one example. I started in a job as a 30-year-old. I went for a job as an economist, and I went for an interview and I didn't get the job, and the man who interviewed me was the managing director and the owner of the business, and a month later he rang me up and said, look, I have another job, I'm really interested in what you offer. It's to manage my office, to be the company secretary, and I'll teach you how to be a consultant, which is what I wanted. I accepted the job. On day one I turned up and I was introduced to another director who I hadn't met,
Yep.
and he didn't know that I had been employed. And I realised I was in trouble. Because my job was supposedly to manage the projects, but deep down what the real job was to manage the tension between the two directors. Very early on, I was berated by the managing director, and I realised that everyone in the office hated him. And everyone was on the other side, the other director's side.
Right.
And so I had to decide as a young man, so what do I do here? So I consciously went to see the managing director one-on-one, and I said, look, you can't ever do that to me again in that public environment. That humiliation does not, you will probably... I actually told him that most people didn't like him.
Yeah.
I told him that there was a war going on, and the war doesn't need to go on if we look after everyone. So I made a pact with him that if he never humiliated me publicly again, I'd support him and work in this task that I had.
So the reciprocity.
The reciprocity.
Yeah.
And, thankfully, so what ended up happening 3 or 4 years later is it was very successful. The business did split. That other director took nearly everyone. Right. Bar me and 3 other people. But when that original business folded, I actually got a job with that other director. So I was very consciously wanting to build a coalition that didn't exclude anybody. Right. And I had to work in a very non-political way. I had to respect everybody and be seen to be supporting. So it's just one example where... Good example. And I had another one when I was younger. I got a job at one of the large transport companies. This was back in the 80s or 90s, I think, and we used to go to have a lunch out. And one of the directors used to come to lunch, and you could call him his first name at lunch. Yeah. But if you ever called him his first name in the office, he would totally ignore you. So I learnt very quickly that the map of relationships was he was John at lunch, but he was Mr. Price when I got to work. Right. And so that was a very good learning for me because I didn't understand the formalities of how... Now,
because not everyone was at that lunch.
Absolutely. Yeah. And formalities today are almost gone. That sort of approach is almost gone. You very rarely, as you said, in Australia, in another country you'd be called professor. Right. In Australia, you're you. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just then talk about political behaviours and influencing in the context of a culture within an organisation. So when you're going for a job, one of the questions you need to ask about is understand the workplace culture. Yep. Okay, so let's move. I've used here the human synergistics picture of culture, but culture is simply the way we do things around here. Yep. Okay, so that's very simple. It's not what we say we do around here.
It's what we do.
It's what we do.
Yep.
So rather than what's written on the wall, it's actually what's lived. And they're 2 very different things in most organisations, and in the best organisations they're the same thing. Yep. Okay. So a way of identifying the great organisations to work for are those that have very little difference between what they say they are and what they are. Yep. So any question that helps you understand whether they embody what they say they are gives you an indication that they'll be a great place to work. So organisations who pursue employer of choice status are a good example of someone who is conscious about being what they say they are. Right. Okay. Right.
One question just on that I have asked at the end of interviews to get an idea of that is, what sort of behaviours or actions are likely to get me a pat on the back around here? So, what sort of things are rewarded? And not in terms of a bonus or a promotion, just a sort of good on you, that's the sort of thing we value.
Yeah. So a good example of not espouse but lived values. Yeah. So what lived values do I need to do to be recognised and rewarded and supported in my development?
Yep. And if you see some of those employers sort of pause at that question, because it is quite a challenging one. Yep. You want to be honest and also want to manage the impression as well from that side. Yeah. It's like, your first day on the job, you don't want to park your car in the chairman's spot. So be aware of, because there will be some, once again,
most of that formalisation is gone, but there are still some workplaces where, you know, certain people sit,
right,
and you
right.
don't sit there because they belong to someone else.
Right.
You know, so that's being able to understand the system that you work in. So let's just briefly talk about these. So 3 organisational cultures, and within human synergistics work, there are cultures within each of these 3. So constructive culture is where people pursue a standard of excellence, people maintain their personal integrity, and people are supportive of each other and they cooperate. Now that's a wonderful workplace. It's a collaborative workplace. It's a workplace that everybody wants to work in. It's also a workplace that everybody wants, but very few create.
Right.
So it's a real question that in the research they've done thousands and thousands of surveys. Everybody wants this, but to create it is incredibly difficult.
Right.
Because we've been talking about aspects about ourselves. We need to be this person.
As well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which then means it's a very real environment where we verbalise what we feel.
Yeah.
And
we're open and transparent.
Open and transparent.
Yeah.
So the other 2 cultures, passive defensive is one where we don't rock the boat. So rather than disagreeing, we might hear a leader or a manager say something. We know it's not right.
Right.
But we know that it's not worth saying it's not right.
Okay.
So we just go along.
Yeah. That sounds like politics.
Yeah, that sounds like politics, very much so.
Yeah.
And these people who lead in these organisations don't ask the question, does everybody understand, does everybody agree?
Right, okay.
Because the culture is that I'm the boss and you should just listen to what I say. Okay? And another one is that they please those in positions of authority and they wait for others to act first. Now, if you're in an environment that has high risk, this is a disaster because, you know, I think when they did the space shuttle research, they realised it was an O-ring worth $1.50 or something.
Right.
And someone had said that it needed to be replaced.
Right.
But because they were in a culture whereby people didn't challenge people above,
or they couldn't be wrong. I mean, it was
couldn't be wrong.
The group thing.
Yeah. So very important.
Yeah.
And then there's the more aggressive. So passive defensive is we all look like we like each other.
Yeah.
But we don't.
Okay.
And we're not fully engaged because we can't bring all of ourselves to work because it's clear that you're the boss.
Right.
And you're not really interested in whether I disagree or agree with you.
Okay.
So there's a lack of innovative thinking and process going on there. But it's polite.
Yeah.
And it's nice.
Okay.
And it's what we see mostly in organisational life. Okay.
Yeah.
The more aggressive one is this aggressive defensive style, which is this: we consciously oppose everything. We play politics to gain influence.
Yep.
We compete and not cooperate. I see this all the time as well, that you see organisational silos like marketing and logistics and finance, and they seem to be at war with each other rather than focusing their attention on cooperating with each other so we can compete with the competition.
Right.
And it never ceases to amaze me that this concept of silos that might even exist in academia, perhaps.
Yeah, it does, even within sort of research disciplines.
So very much part of it. So that's part of this aggressive defensive. So what we've got is these 3 cultures, as we probably both mentioned. Politics plays out in passive defensive. It plays out in aggressive defensive. It tends not to play out in constructive. That doesn't mean that there's not politics in constructive, because there's lots of influencing, but it's all up front. It's all transparent. It's on the trust and power scale.
Right.
The passive defensive and aggressive defensive is off the power, trust and power scale.
Right.
And that's the aspect.
I have a question. Earlier you were talking about the controlling of information and its link with political influence. Say and I'm trying to relate this to a constructive style still. Say I'm person B, you're person A, and person C is over there. Person A has knowledge and information that person C needs to do his or her work, and the other way around as well, but they are connected through me. Now, if I relinquish my position here and person A and C can work together and produce whatever they want to produce, I lose a bit of power.
Yep.
But if I keep my position there and don't let them connect directly, but only through me, is that a sort of, would that be a constructive approach, or is that more of a, would you say that's towards the passive or aggressive style?
Yes, I would.
And it's controlling information still, but maybe in a constructive way, is it, or not?
It could be.
Yeah.
If we were working on being our best,
Yep.
you would relinquish power
All right.
because you know that it's the most efficient, effective solution.
Sure.
But you may
Yeah.
create a healthy interface,
Yeah.
be aware of it, but not control it.
Okay.
Okay, so last week I was running what I call an interface conversation, and it's between two departments. And there are issues between the two departments. They're not getting on with each other.
Yeah.
And one of my challenges is, well, what's the source of the discontent?
Right.
Does it belong at the process level? Does it belong at middle management? Does it belong at senior management? Does it belong in the performance management systems, the KPIs that nurture silo thinking and silo behaviour,
Right.
to the degree that I don't care about you?
Right.
So
right.
like you've got these two areas,
Yep.
you can see that it's not the best solution.
Yep.
And depending on who you are and depending on the values of the organisation about teamwork, you may have to make a personal decision that says, I may lose power, but my experience is that you will gain power by giving it away.
Other ways. Yeah. Okay.
So power is also, it's a bit mysterious.
Yep.
So it's a little bit like the example we gave where people who have less formal power but have enormous influence
Right.
because they operate in this relationship space,
And trust. Yeah.
they end up being far more powerful than anybody else, and they're the go-to people.
Right.
So I would suggest that a constructive thing, you know it's the right thing,
Yep.
the most efficient and effective thing. I think that builds your power base because you're seen as you're the controller of the system.
Yeah.
You've identified two people who need to be in contact with each other and working together.
And you're not putting yourself, your own interest.
It's a little bit like the quote about leadership that,
Yep.
you know, they went down there and won the fight, and the general who had created the environment, everyone was talking about how successful they were, but deep down,
Yep.
the general knew exactly what they were doing to create the conditions for success.
Right. Right.
So great leaders don't need to be heroic leaders.
Right.
They can actually be in the background
Yep.
and know that they're managing the system
The best way
actively,
possible.
but the best way possible.
Yeah. Okay.
But in a political environment,
Yeah.
you wouldn't do that. A political environment, you would
Keep
not.
that place,
yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
you would consciously say that I don't want the best thing for the organisation.
Right. Right. Right.
See, so there's
Yep.
a conflict there in terms of ethics, because
Yep.
sometimes you want the best, you know, and you may then challenge yourself about, well, do I want to be in this place?
Sure.
Yep. So if we talk about these three cultures, if you're applying for a job, asking some questions that are on this slide is probably helpful.
Okay. Yep.
You know, how do things work?
Yep.
What sort of culture is there?
Yep.
And if you broadly base some of your questions around that, how do decisions get made?
Yes.
You
You get an idea of how.
get an idea.
political-
Yeah. I'll just provide those slides because they give you subsets of the culture in each of those
Oh,
areas.
excellent. Can we post this online? Can we?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thanks. Yep.
So something we do within Mirror, the organisation I work in, is we actually have this concept of a first organisation, and we've spoken a little bit about it. The first organisation is who we say we are.
Yep.
The second organisation is what we are.
Right.
And this green in the middle is the challenge to get the two things together.
Sure.
What we are and what we say we are and what we really are is one and the same. So they're the best organisation to work for, and what that means is that we all have blind spots.
Yep.
Okay. And the blind spots are in that red
Right.
because we don't see that it's not consistent with what we say we are. And the challenge is that, you know, on this right-hand side, I talk about make unwritten, open, visible play rules. So once again, back to the trust and power scale.
Yep.
Those play rules should be building
Yep.
something that's consistent with the strategic intent of the organisation
Right.
in the context of values and behaviours.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
And so down there at the bottom, we're talking about I want to be involved when I'm working in a workplace that's respectful. I'm not a piece of machinery.
Yep.
And not a cog in the wheel. If I'm treated equally, and if my effort is recognised, I'll then provide more and more effort. So we're wanting to that once again, it's the constructive culture.
Yep.
So moving from those other two, passive defensive, aggressive defensive, into constructive is bringing these two pieces together.
Right.
Where the first organisation and the second organisation are the same thing. Yep. So, to reiterate, when you're about to embark on your career, these aspects are relevant for you in preparing yourself to, one, get an interview, to be in an environment where we'll be healthy for your career. So another example, when I started in another role, I had an interview with a recruiter. I went and met the human resource person in the consulting business. He thought that I would fit into the business. So I met the CEO. We got on well. So we agreed that I would come for a day. I wouldn't be paid for it, but I would come and I would be interviewed by 10 different people in the organisation. And at the end of that day, those 10 people would all come together, and me, and they would ask me what I felt. Was I a fit? And they would tell me whether I was a fit for them. And then I'd meet again with the CEO and the recruitment person and make a decision about whether I was going to proceed. And that was a wonderful way for me to find out about the system that we're talking about here. So if that's an if that's an opportunity for someone, because that means you get to know more. So if you know someone who works there, it's a great thing. If you know someone who used to work there, go and find out, use those political influencing skills of network and coalition building, so you can build your knowledge base before you go into that job interview.
Excellent.
We've spoken about blind spots. I think let's have a look at our questions. Have we?
Yeah, look, I think we've definitely addressed all of those questions. One sort of finishing question I had in mind, but I think you've already addressed it, is not all politics is bad. Perhaps, and sometimes we may need to use it. How can we use it in constructive and ethical ways? And I think, what you mentioned about building coalitions and networks,
those skills
to access influence and power is one of those ways. You also touched on resisting negative influence. Again, it really comes down to the relationships and access to important people in the organisation.
If you get rid of that slide and we get to talk. So the only thing we haven't spoken about is how we manage conflict, I suppose.
Oh yeah, okay.
Because, but really, managing conflict, I think we've already covered in how we do it. We need to be actively involved in the relationship. We need to be observing what's going on and understanding the other person's interests. And we need to be actively engaged in the conversation. So I use this phrase, people are cold in conflict, and they're people who dislike conflict and avoid it at all costs. Then there are people who are hot in conflict, and they're the loud people who almost seem to spend their time searching for conflict.
Sounds like my wife.
And so probably, you're together because there's that dynamic of cold and hot. And once again, like the trust and power scale, the challenge is to cool down the hot ones, warm up the cold ones, and meet somewhere in the middle. And the middle is where the people who say they're not in conflict but can say they are. Then the hot ones can cool down and calm down and speak, so everyone can be engaged in a healthy conversation. And really, our challenge here is for healthy relationship, because once if you and I are in conflict and we stay in the organisation and we don't resolve it, we'll create workarounds where we avoid each other.
And
so once again, as you said about the two people, and you can see it, those workarounds can be destructive. So constructive doesn't mean no conflict. It means we resolve conflict openly, transparently, and we fight fair together. And ultimately, you will need that skill set
Yep.
as you progress up in an organisation, because
Right.
it becomes more and more robust
Yep.
as you move up the organisation.
Yep. And I mean, one of the things that contributes to conflict is just another person or group probably blocking your access to something you care about.
Yep.
And as you move up an organisation, that's probably going to happen more and more as resources become a little
Yeah.
tighter.
And it's important then you can influence
Yeah.
based on
yeah.
strategic intent
Right.
and based on your ability to tell a story that engages everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the truth is that there is competition for scarce resources.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's those who present the best story will
Right.
get the resources.
Yeah.
So once again, we're building your influencing capabilities, because that's what happens when you get into senior roles, that you
Right.
become more and more influential.
Right.
And one of the skills is, as we've spoken about those other skills,
Yep.
the ability to tell a story that
Yep.
everyone engages in,
Right.
which involves emotion. So we go back to that emotional
Yep.
intelligence aspect. That becomes more and more important as we move up the organisation, and
Yep.
managing. The truth is, we have to manage ourselves and everybody else
Yep.
all the time.
Okay.
you know.
Excellent. Fantastic. This has been, in my view anyway, the most valuable conversation so far in this unit. Thank you. I've learned so much.
Wonderful.
Thanks again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.